I had built something with my hands for 40 years. 40 years of sawdust in my lungs and varnish under my fingernails. In early mornings when the rest of Bath was still sleeping, and I was already at the bench, running my palm along a length of Georgian oak, feeling for the grain the way a doctor feels for a pulse. 40 years of learning what old wood wants from you. 40 years of understanding that a door restored correctly does not look like a new door. It looks like itself, only better understood. All of that. 40 years of all of that. And it took one sentence, spoken over a Sunday roast at a table set with someone else's china, to make me understand what I actually was to my own family. Not a father, not a founder, not a man who had built something worth protecting. I was a signature, waiting on a piece of paper, waiting, as it turned out, to die before I got in the way of plans I had not yet been told about. The sentence was this. Claudia raised her glass, turned to the table with that particular smile she has, the one that is always positioned just a degree or two too precisely to be spontaneous, and she said, "To the old man who finally knows when to let go." She said it like a toast. She said it like something warm. And every person at that table smiled and lifted their glass and drank. Every person, including my son. My son Simon did not look at me when she said it. He looked at his plate. He moved his fork slightly and adjusted the fold of his linen napkin, and he drank from his glass, and he did not say a single word. That silence was the thing that stayed with me. Not Claudia's words, which I had been feeling the shape of for months without quite knowing what to call them. It was Simon's silence, the particular quality of it, the careful, practiced quality of a man who has decided in advance not to respond to something, not because he disagrees, but because responding would cost him something he is not prepared to pay. That is where this story begins. In that silence. Let me tell you what happened next. But before I do, I need to stop for just a moment. Because right now, sitting here telling you this, I realize I have never said any of this out loud to another person who was not already inside the situation. And here you are, listening. So let me ask you something. Where are you right now? What city? What country? Drop it in the comments below, because I genuinely want to know who is out there with me on a day like this. And what time is it where you are? Is it morning? Is it late at night? And you cannot sleep. I understand that better than I can properly explain. If this story is reaching you somewhere real, leave a like. It means more to me than you might think. And subscribe if you want to know what happened, because I have quite a lot left to tell you. Now let me get back to that Sunday afternoon, because there is a great deal you need to understand before the ending makes the kind of sense it deserves to make. The house at 23 Great Pulteney Street is the kind of address that Bath reserves for people who want to announce something about themselves. The street itself is long and perfectly proportioned. The Georgian terraces running in pale honey-stone rows that catch the afternoon light in a way that has been photographed 10,000 times by people visiting from elsewhere. The Pulteney Bridge at one end, Laura Place at the other. Everything balanced, everything considered. Simon and Claudia rented there. They did not own. I knew this. But the address appeared in correspondence, on invitations, in Claudia's descriptions of the house to people she was meeting for the first time, always with the particular weight of someone who expects the name of the street to do work on their behalf. I had driven past that house on the way to jobs in the early days. There had been a property there once, a door surround in desperate need of attention, and I had quoted for it, years before Simon met Claudia, years before any of this was what it is now. I had stood on that pavement and looked at the stone pilasters flanking the entrance, and thought that whoever designed that doorway understood something about permanence. I thought about that walking to the house on the Sunday in question. It was the 22nd of March, the kind of Bath Sunday that looks like spring from the inside of a house and feels like winter the moment you step out. A thin, pale sky, the sound of the Avon moving under the bridge, my own footsteps on the pavement, which I was aware of in a way I am not usually, as if my body was telling me to pay attention. The lunch had been Claudia's idea. She called it a family gathering. She used that phrase precisely, a family gathering. The guest list included Martin Bell, who is my company accountant and has been for 11 years, which should have told me something in itself. You do not invite the company accountant to a family roast unless the occasion has a purpose that is not purely social. Judith was there as well. My older sister, 61 years old, silver-haired, wearing the kind of wool cardigan she has worn since approximately 1987. Judith and I have the particular closeness of two people who grew up in the same small terraced house in Twerton and then spent 40 years navigating the distance that adult life creates. We are not sentimental with each other, but when I look at her, I see the kitchen we grew up in, and the smell of our mother's cooking, and the sound of our father's boots on the front step. And all of that means something to me that I could not reduce to a sentence if I tried. The table was set formally. White china with a pale blue rim. Good crystal. Someone had ironed the tablecloth. Claudia was in a charcoal gray dress, her hair pulled back. She moved through the room in the particular way she has, not quite hosting, not quite performing, but occupying the space in a way that made it clear whose occasion this was. Simon looked well. He always looks well. He has Eleanor's coloring, the dark eyes and the slightly too serious expression that Eleanor used to break so beautifully when something amused her. He had that expression as I came in, the serious one, and he embraced me at the door and said it was good I had come and offered to take my coat, and none of it felt like anything at all, which is a particular kind of terrible when the person doing it is your own son. We ate. The roast was good. There is no reason to pretend otherwise. Claudia is a very capable cook when she chooses to be, which made the whole thing slightly more disorienting than it might have been if the food had been ordinary. Everything about the occasion was executed well. The wine was correct for the season. The conversation moved through appropriate subjects. Martin Bell asked about a contract I had quoted on in Lansdowne, and I answered, and the conversation moved on. I was watching. I had been watching for a while by then, though I had not yet said that to myself in those terms. I had been noticing things, not cataloging them deliberately, just noticing them the way a man who has spent 40 years reading wood learns to notice when something is not settled properly, when there is stress beneath the surface that the exterior has not yet revealed. The first thing I had noticed, about 6 weeks before the Sunday lunch, was that Simon had taken to answering my calls on the first ring. This sounds like a good thing. It is not. Not when the man in question had previously let calls go to voicemail with the regularity of a person who is managing their availability. The prompt answering meant he was expecting me. It meant he was positioned. It meant that what I said, and perhaps how I said it, was being considered in advance. The second thing was that Claudia had begun referring to the company as the business, not Whitmore Heritage Restorations, which is what it is called, not the firm or the company or even Arthur's company. The business, as if it were a generic thing, as if the name on the sign were a temporary condition rather than the thing itself. The third thing was something Martin Bell said in the office 3 weeks before the lunch when he called to discuss the quarterly figures. He mentioned in passing that he had spoken to Simon about something and then corrected himself and said it was nothing important. Martin Bell has been my accountant for 11 years. In 11 years, he has never called something nothing important and then moved on without explanation. Martin Bell is a precise and specific man. When he calls something nothing important, he is calling it something important. These were the things I was carrying to that table on the 22nd of March. Not accusations, not certainties. Just the particular unease of a man who has learned to read surfaces for what lies beneath them. The toast came at 1:20. Claudia had been in the kitchen for a moment and came back with a fresh bottle. She poured for everyone and then stood, which was itself a thing worth noticing, because people do not stand at a Sunday lunch table without having decided to stand, without having thought about it in advance. To the old man who finally knows when to let go. The words sat in the air above the table. Everyone smiled. The glasses went up. Simon adjusted his napkin and looked at his plate and drank. I lifted my glass. I smiled with the particular kind of patience that I've been cultivating for a very long time. And I drank. And I thought about Eleanor. She died 6 years ago in February. Pancreatic cancer, which is the kind of thing that does not give you much time to prepare, which is both a mercy and a cruelty, depending on the moment you consider it. She had been with me since we were both 23 years old. She had been there when I registered the company name. She had been in the workshop on the first night we worked late on a commission that was too large for just me, and she had stayed until 11:30 lixing a section of skirting board because she understood, without my explaining it, that the work was not going to wait. Eleanor is not the reason I built the company, but she is the reason the company is what it is. She understood what the name meant. She understood that restoring a Georgian door in a house that has stood for 250 years is not the same thing as fitting new windows or repointing a chimney. It is a conversation with the past. It is a kind of honesty. You are saying, this thing was made well and it deserves to keep being what it is. I drove home from Great Pulteney Street alone, across the Pulteney Bridge, watching the weir through the stone arches, the water pale and fast and very certain of where it was going. A thin mist of rain was starting, the particular Bath drizzle that never quite decides to commit. I did not turn on the radio. I drove the 3.5 minutes to Prior Park Road and let myself in and stood in the hallway for a moment without taking my coat off. The house is modest by most standards. 3 bedrooms, one of which I use as a study. A kitchen that still has the original aga my parents helped me afford when I bought the place in 1989. The sitting room overlooks the garden, which I maintain without passion, but with consistency because Eleanor cared about it, and I care about that. On the kitchen shelf, above the kettle, there is a blue cup. It was Eleanor's. She drank her morning tea from it for years, a particular pale blue with a small chip on the handle that she always said she preferred to a perfect one because it meant it had been used. I have not moved it. I do not intend to. I put the kettle on. I stood at the counter. I looked at the blue cup. What I felt was not anger. I want to be precise about this because it matters. Anger would have been simpler. Anger has a shape and a direction and an object, and it moves through you and out of you if you let it. What I felt was something older and quieter and heavier. Something that lives deeper in the body than anger does. Something that felt, if I am honest, like the recognition of a thing I had been pretending not to see. She was brindando to my removal. That was what the toast was. Not a celebration of generosity, not an acknowledgement of succession, a social performance designed to make my departure from the company feel like something I had agreed to in front of witnesses. And Simon had not said a word. I made the tea. I did not put it in the blue cup. I put it in a plain one, a brown glazed thing I have had since university. I carried it to the sitting room and I sat in the chair I always sit in, which is positioned so that the left arm catches the light from the window in the afternoon, and I thought for a long time without reaching for my telephone or the television or a book. This is something I can do that younger people often cannot. I have spent enough of my life in rooms with old things, things that require patience and quiet attention, that I have learned how to sit with a difficult thought without immediately needing to make it move. The thought was this. My son had not spoken, and the particular silence he had chosen was not the silence of a man who disagreed and was choosing his moment. It was the silence of a man who had already decided which side of something he was standing on. I wanted to be wrong about that. I want you to understand that. A father wants nothing more than to be wrong about the worst thing he suspects of his child. Let me tell you what I found that evening. I had not intended to go through the study. I had intended to sit with my tea until it was cold and then make some soup and go to bed. But there is a thing that happens sometimes when you are moving around a house that belongs to your own history. You end up in rooms you did not plan to enter. You open drawers you had forgotten contained anything at all. The drawer in question was the lower left drawer of the desk Eleanor used to use for correspondence. After she died, I had moved her things carefully and put certain things away, and left the desk largely as it was because the desk felt like a room of hers that I did not want to reclaim. The lower left drawer I had not opened in perhaps 4 years. Inside it, beneath a small watercolor she had done of the view from the workshop window and a packet of letters she had kept from her own mother, there was an envelope. Her handwriting on the front. Not addressed to me, not addressed to anyone, just an envelope with her handwriting. which I recognized the way you recognize a voice on a telephone before the person says who they are. Inside the envelope was a single piece of paper, 3 paragraphs in her careful, slightly forward-leaning script. She had written, "A family business is only a family business as long as the family understands that the business is not the point. The business is what the family made together from something. The point is the something. The craft, the care, the understanding that some things should not be handed over to people who see only what they can sell." She had written, "If the name on the door stops meaning anything, the door is just wood." She had written, "Don't let anyone make you feel old, Arthur. You are not old. You are experienced. There is a considerable difference, and anyone who cannot see it is not paying the right kind of attention." I sat at her desk for a long time after reading that. I did not cry. I have learned to hold grief without being held by it. That is perhaps the most difficult thing I have learned in 6 years of being without her. What I did was think. I thought about the toast, about the word finally, about the specific weight that word carries in that sentence. Finally. As if there had been a long waiting. As if my continuation had been an inconvenience being endured. I thought about Martin Bell's correction on the telephone, about the speed with which Simon now answers my calls. I thought about the company, about the first contract I signed in that workshop, which was for a door restoration on Brock Street in 1986, and which took me 6 weeks to complete, and which I still drive past sometimes, because the door is still standing and is still right, and that matters to me in a way I could not reduce to a financial figure if someone asked me to try. I thought about what Claudia sees when she looks at Whitmore Heritage Restorations. I thought about the fact that she had never once come into the workshop. Not once, in the 8 years she had been married to my son, had she sat on one of the workshop stools and watched someone work on a piece. She had attended the company dinner once, 3 years ago, and had spoken mostly to the other partners' spouses. She had asked me, on that occasion, whether I had ever considered expanding into residential interior design more broadly, which is a question that reveals, if you know how to listen to it, a fundamental misunderstanding of what the company is for. By 10:30 that evening I had made a decision. Not out of anger. Not out of self-protection in the way the word self-protection is usually meant. Out of something that felt more like responsibility, the way I feel responsible for a door entrusted to me, the way I feel responsible for what has been made and what has been promised. I would go to Margaret Henshaw in the morning, and I would change one clause. Margaret Henshaw has an office at 7 Queen Square, which is one of Bath's more beautiful Georgian set pieces, the square laid out in the early 18th century, the stone worn to the particular honey and silver combination that Bath does better than anywhere else on earth. I have done work on properties in that square. I know the stone. I know what the doorways ask of you. Margaret is 55 and has been practicing law for 30 years and was Eleanor's friend before she was my lawyer, which means I trust her in the way you trust a person who knew you before you needed them for anything professional. She is precise, and she is not warm in the conventional sense, but she is honest in the way that I have found, over the course of a long life, is considerably more valuable. I arrived at 8:45. She was already at her desk. She made tea without asking whether I wanted it, which is one of her better qualities, and she sat across from me and folded her hands on the desk and waited for me to tell her why I was there. I told her about the Sunday lunch. Not the emotional weight of it. Not at first, but the facts of it. Who was present, what was said, what was not said. I told her about Martin Bell and the correction on the telephone. I told her about the envelope in the drawer. Margaret listened. She did not interrupt. This is one of the most reliable things about her. When I had finished, she said, "What do you want to do?" I told her. I did not want to remove Simon from the succession. That needs to be understood clearly. I am his father. He is my son. The company has his name on it, not just because of mine, but because of Eleanor's, and Eleanor is his mother. And there is no legal instrument that can change what that means, and I would not want one if there were. What I wanted was a clause. a single amendment to the existing succession agreement, something quiet and specific. The way good woodwork is quiet and specific. The clause would establish that Simon could assume full operational control of Whitmore Heritage Restorations under the following conditions: 3 years of active management, during which the existing historic restoration contracts must be maintained, not liquidated. The current long-term staff, 4 people who have been with the company for more than a decade, must remain employed under their existing terms. No sale of the company name, the workshop premises, or the client archive to any external investor group during the 3-year period without Arthur Whitmore's written consent. In the event of any attempt to force a premature transfer of ownership through legal pressure, public documentation of incapacity, or the removal of Arthur Whitmore from operational decisions by non-consensual means, the controlling share of the company would transfer immediately to the Eleanor Whitmore Foundation for Heritage Craft, which is a foundation I had not yet established, but which Margaret could help me establish before the week was out. Margaret looked at the notes she had made. She said, "This is a measured response." I said, "I am a measured person." She said, "I will need a few days." I said, "I will call on Thursday." I walked back across Queen Square into the morning. The stone was pale in the light. A pigeon was examining something on the pavement near the central garden, with the particular focused indifference of pigeons everywhere. The air smelled of rain and coffee from a cafe on the corner. I felt, walking back to where I had parked the car, something I had not felt since the Sunday of the lunch. Not relief? Not yet. But the particular steady feeling of a man who has looked at a problem clearly and chosen the right tool for it. The work, as Eleanor used to say, tells you what it needs. You just have to be willing to listen. Now let me tell you about what I found in the workshop 3 days later, because it changes the shape of everything I have just told you, and because what I found there confirmed, with the particular cold precision of a thing written in someone else's handwriting on someone else's paper, that my instincts on the Sunday of the toast had not been the anxiety of an old man. They had been accurate. They had been, if anything, not quite worried enough. Before I get to that, I want to stop for just a moment, because some of you have been with me since the beginning of this, and I want to acknowledge that. Where are you watching from? Your city, your country? Put it in the comments. I read them, all of them. And if what I am telling you is sitting somewhere in your chest right now in a way you recognize from your own life, leave a like. Share this with someone who might need it. Subscribe if you have not, because there is more of this story to come, and I think you will want to be here for the next part. All right, let me tell you what I found. The workshop at 28 Walcott Street is a converted ground floor unit in a building that was originally a Georgian coaching house. The ceilings are high. The back wall is exposed stone. There are 3 long workbenches and a rack of tools organized in the way that Eleanor helped me organize them in 1993, which is to say by function and frequency of use rather than by size, which sounds obvious but which most people do not do. There is a small glazed office at the back where I keep contracts and client files, and the sample archive, which is a collection of wood and finish samples going back 30 years that I use when consulting on period restoration. The sample archive lives in a series of flat wooden drawers. Each drawer is labeled. Each sample has a card with the property, the date, the treatment applied, and my notes on the result. It is the kind of record that has no monetary value to anyone who does not understand what it represents, which is a chronology of specific decisions made in service of specific old buildings. To me, it is something like a diary. To Eleanor, it was evidence, she used to say, that we had been paying attention. On the Wednesday afternoon, 4 days after the Sunday lunch, I was in the workshop finishing a section of panel work for a house on the circus. It was 4 in the afternoon. The light was doing what it does in March in Bath, going golden and then going quickly. I was working by feel more than sight, which is something you can only do with materials you know very well. I needed a reference sample. There was a particular finish I was trying to match, a dark oil treatment on what appeared to be original early 19th century pine, and I needed the drawer with my notes from a similar job I had done on the Royal Crescent 11 years ago. I pulled the drawer open. Inside the drawer, alongside the samples, there was a document I did not put there. It was a sheaf of papers, folded once, tucked between two sample cards, as if it had been placed there quickly and without great thought about whether it would be found. Cream paper, printed text, a logo at the top that I did not immediately recognize, a Bristol address beneath it, a heading that said, Brand Acquisition Proposal, Preliminary Framework. I stood at the drawer for what I think was quite a long time, long enough for the light to shift, long enough to hear a van go past on Walcott Street and the sound of someone talking in the adjacent unit, and then silence again. I read it, all of it. I will not go through it line by line here, not because I want to spare anyone anything, but because some of what it contained is still a matter I am being careful about. What I will tell you is the shape of it, a Bristol-based private investment group, a framework for acquiring an established heritage restoration brand and repositioning it as a premium residential renovation firm operating across the Southwest and into London. An emphasis on high net worth clients. A proposed new name for the company, not Whitmore Heritage Restorations, but something modern and unattributed. A budget projection based on the existing client archive and the workshop premises as a flagship location. And a note, written by hand in a margin. In handwriting I recognized because I had read notes from the same hand on planning documents related to the company before. The note said, Need to move AW out of decision-making optics before Q4. Legal, still working on it. AW. I stood at the bench. I set the document down on the flat surface next to the sample drawer. I put both my hands on the bench and stood there. The workshop smelled of linseed oil and old wood, and the particular dry smell of stone walls in a building that was 200 years old. I have worked in this smell for 30 years. I know every variation of it. I stood there for a long time. What I felt was not what I expected to feel. I had been moving toward something like this for weeks without knowing what it was, and now I knew, and what I felt was not shock exactly. It was more like the settling of a thing that has been uncertain into a shape you can finally examine properly. It was a plan, a specific plan, put together with some care, involving a Bristol investment firm and a rebranding exercise and the removal of my name and my involvement from the company I had built from nothing in 1986. And it had been in the works for long enough that someone had printed a preliminary framework document and put it, or left it, in my own workshop. I did not call Simon. I did not call Claudia. I did not call Martin Bell, which I want you to note because Martin Bell's name was in the document, not prominently, but it was there. I called Margaret Henshaw. She answered on the second ring. I told her what I had found. I described the document. I asked her whether the clause amendments we had discussed were ready. She said they would be ready by Friday. I said, make it Thursday, if possible. She said she would try. I said, Margaret. She said, yes. I said, the 3-year clause. The operational conditions. Can those be structured so that there is absolutely no ambiguity in the language? No room for an argument about interpretation. She said, that is what I do, Arthur. I said, I know. I just want to be certain. I put the document back in the drawer where I had found it. Not because I needed to pretend I had not seen it. Because I needed to think carefully about the precise moment and manner in which I chose to let people know that I had. There is a difference between having information and deploying it. I have lived long enough to understand that the first is not useful without the second, and the second requires patience and timing, and the willingness to let things develop at the pace they need to develop. Eleanor used to say that the most important thing in restoration work is knowing when not to touch something. You look at it first. You understand it first. You let it tell you what it is before you decide what to do. I closed the drawer. I went back to the panel I'd been working on. I finished the section I had started. I worked until 6 o'clock. Then I put my tools away in the correct order, which I always do, and I turned off the workshop lights, and I locked the door, and I walked to the car. The Walcott Street traffic was light. A few people outside the pub on the corner. The lights of the city beginning to come on in the early dusk. The Abbey Tower visible above the roofline, pale stone going gold and then gray. I thought about something my father used to say, which was that a man who reacts from the center of his anger usually ends up apologizing to someone he shouldn't. I thought about that for the drive home. I thought about what it means to respond instead of react. I thought about what Eleanor would have done. She would have made tea. She would have sat at the kitchen table. She would have thought for exactly as long as she needed to think and no longer. And then she would have done the precise thing required. Not the dramatic thing. Not the satisfying thing. The right thing. I made tea. I sat at the kitchen table. I thought. By 8 o'clock that evening, I knew what the right thing was. And I want to stop here for a moment, because I think some of you watching this right now know exactly the kind of night I am describing. The kind where you are sitting at a table with a cup of tea and a piece of knowledge you did not ask for, and a decision in front of you that is going to cost something regardless of which way you go. You know that feeling. Some of you are sitting in that feeling right now. Tell me in the comments. Tell me where you are, your city, your country, and tell me if you have ever had to make a decision like this, where the right thing and the easy thing were not the same thing at all. Leave a like if this story is speaking to you. Subscribe, because there is considerably more to tell, and what comes next is the part that required everything I had learned in 40 years of doing this work. Stay with me. I am just getting to the part where things change. The Thursday meeting with Margaret was quiet and procedural in the way that the most consequential things often are. Her office in Queen Square was exactly as it always is. Ordered, slightly cool, the smell of paper and the faint sound of the square outside. She had the amended documents ready. She walked me through the language with the particular care she takes with everything, pausing at each clause to confirm that my understanding matched her drafting. The operational continuity requirement, 3 years of active management, the staff protection clause, the prohibition on brand sale or rebranding without consent, the transfer mechanism to the Eleanor Whitmore Foundation for Heritage Craft, which Margaret had established as a preliminary entity with the relevant documentation already in place. I signed where she indicated. She said, "Do you want to tell Simon before the formal meeting or at it?" I said, "At it." She said, "You understand this is going to be difficult for him." I said, "I know. I am hoping it is difficult in the right way." She looked at me for a moment. She said, "Eleanor would have done the same thing." I said, "I know that too. That is rather the point." The formal meeting was scheduled for the following week. Margaret's office issued the invitations through the correct channels. Simon as prospective successor, Claudia as accompanying party, Martin Bell as company accountant, and Arthur Whitmore as company founder and current sole director. I will tell you about that meeting in the next part of this story because it deserves to be told in full and in the right order. But I want to tell you first about the 11 days between signing the amended documents and sitting down at that table. Because those 11 days were not easy, and I do not want to give you the impression that having made the right decision meant that everything felt resolved. It did not. I called Simon 3 times during those 11 days. Normal calls, the way we had always spoken. How was the work on the Lansdowne project coming? Had he spoken to the client on Brock Street about the timing? Was he planning to come to the industry dinner in April? He answered promptly each time. He was precise and professional, and there was, underneath all of it, the particular quality of a man who is waiting for something to happen and trying not to let the waiting show. I did not mention the Sunday lunch. I did not mention the document in the drawer. I did not mention Margaret or the amended clause. I talked about the work, which is what we have always been best at when we talk, and I listened to his voice, and I thought about the boy who used to come to the workshop after school and sit on the end of one of the benches and do his homework while I worked, the sound of the radio and the sound of tools and the smell of the workshop settling around both of us like a room we both belonged in. He had been a quiet child, observant. He used to watch me work with a concentration that I had taken for a long time as evidence of a genuine engagement with the craft. I wonder now whether what he was watching was not the work itself, but something else. Not the process of restoration, but the process of making something that people wanted. Whether he understood, earlier than I did, that what I was making was not just a restored door or a preserved staircase, but a reputation, a position, something that could be leveraged. I do not say this to condemn him. I say it because I think it is probably true, and I think it is probably more my failure than his that I did not see it earlier. There is a type of person in the world who loves what you have built without ever quite understanding why you built it, who sees the value without seeing the cost, who would take the thing carefully, even lovingly, without ever understanding that the thing is inseparable from the reasons it was made. Claudia is that person plainly and clearly. I am no longer certain that Simon is not, at least in part, that person too, but I am his father, and I have a particular responsibility as his father, that I will not surrender to a grief about his limitations. The responsibility is this: to protect what was made, and to give him, if it is possible, the chance to become someone who understands why it matters. I am going to stop here for a moment. We are getting close to the part of the story that I have thought about more than any other part. The meeting in the conference room at Walcott Street, the reading of the clause, the expressions on the faces of the people sitting at that table. I want you to be ready for it, so tell me, are you still with me? Where are you watching from right now? Your city, your country? Drop it in the comments. Leave a like if Arthur Whitmore's story is sitting somewhere in you the way it has been sitting in me. Subscribe for the next part because I will be delivering it very soon. And share this if you know someone who has had to make a decision like this, who has had to choose between what is easy and what is right for the thing they built and the people they love. All right, let me keep going, because there is a great deal left to tell, and the most important part has not happened yet. The 11 days were quiet in the way that the period before something significant is often quiet, the way the river goes smooth before it narrows. I worked. I went to the workshop early each morning because the workshop is where I am most fully myself, where the questions that other parts of my life raise do not quite follow me in, or if they do, they settle into the background, the way a sound you have heard long enough becomes part of the room rather than a disruption in it. I was working on the panel for the circus house. It was taking longer than I had originally quoted, not because I had misjudged the work, but because I had found once I had the original panel sections apart that the damage went further back than the surface had suggested. This is a common thing in restoration work. The exterior presents one picture. The interior, once you are inside it, presents another. You cannot rush what the material is telling you. You adjust your timeline and you do the work that needs doing. I thought about that working on the panel, about the difference between what presents itself on the surface and what is actually occurring in the structure beneath it, about the particular patience required to work with something old and complex without forcing it into a shape that is easier to manage than it is correct. On the 5th day of the 11, I drove to Twerton and had lunch with Judith. She has a terraced house not unlike the one we grew up in, 2 streets over from where we were born, which I have always found both touching and characteristically Judith. She is not a sentimental person, but she is a rooted one. We sat at her kitchen table with soup and bread, and she poured me a glass of water without asking and set down a small dish of butter the way our mother always did. And I thought, sitting there, that the continuity of small gestures across a lifetime is one of the things that holds people together. I told her about the Sunday lunch. Not everything, but enough. I told her about the toast, and about Simon's silence, and about the document in the drawer. Judith listened the way she always listens, with her hands around her cup, and her face very still. When I had finished, she said, "What are you going to do?" I told her about the clause. She said, "Margaret Henshaw." I said, "Yes." She said, "Good." She looked at her soup for a moment. She said, "Arthur, you know this is not about the company." I said, "I know." She said, "It is about the fact that they stopped seeing you." I said, "I know that too." She said, "Eleanor would have gone to Margaret in the morning." I said, "She went in spirit. I just went in body." Judith made a small sound that was not quite a laugh, but was in that direction. She said, "You sound like her when you say things like that." I said, "I will take that." We sat in her kitchen for another hour and talked about things that had nothing to do with Claudia or Simon or the company, and it was one of the better hours of those 11 days. I am going to take a breath here. We are moving toward the meeting, and I want to make sure you are fully with me, because the meeting is where the shape of this story becomes finally clear. So one more time, where are you? What city? What country? Drop it in the comments. Hit the like button if Arthur's story has earned it. Subscribe for the next part. And let me take you into that conference room on Walcott Street on a Tuesday morning in early April, when 5 people sat down at a table where I signed the first contract of my professional life, and one of them did not yet know that everything was about to change. The conference room at 28 Walcott Street is not a grand space. It is a room I built with 3 weeks of work in 2003, converting what had been a storage area into something appropriate for client meetings. I plastered the walls myself. I put down the oak boards myself. I chose the table, which is a piece I found in a salvage yard in Frome, an early 20th century library table in mahogany, heavy and dark and very solid. I had it restored by a craftsman I trusted, and then I carried it into the room with the help of 2 of the workshop staff, and it has been in that room ever since. I have signed contracts on that table. I have shaken hands across it. I have sat on my side of it and shown clients samples, and talked about what the work would involve and what it would cost and what they would have at the end of it that they did not have at the beginning. I have sat at that table and told one client that the door they wanted us to restore was beyond restoration, and watched the particular grief that sometimes crosses people's faces when they understand that something they hope to save cannot be saved. The table matters to me in the way that the workshop matters, in the way that the address on Walcott Street matters. It is part of the physical record of what was made here. On the Tuesday morning in question, I arrived at 8:30. The meeting was called for 9. I made coffee in the small kitchen adjacent to the conference room. I set 5 cups on the table. I put the document I had found in the sample drawer, sealed now in a plain envelope, on the table in front of my chair. Margaret arrived first, at 8:10, which is characteristic of her. She set her briefcase beside the chair to my right and accepted a cup of coffee, and we sat for a moment without speaking, which is one of the things I appreciate about her company. The room was quiet, morning light through the high window, the smell of the coffee and the old mahogany and the stone walls. At 9:02, I heard the front door. Simon came in first. He looked at me across the table, and there was a moment, very brief, where his expression was simply that of a son seeing his father, unguarded and uncomplicated. And then the other layers came back, and he said good morning and sat down. And Martin Bell came in behind him, and then Claudia. Claudia was dressed impeccably, as she always is. A slate blue jacket, her hair perfectly arranged. She set her things down and greeted Margaret by name with the particular warmth Claudia deploys when she wants something from a room, and she sat and she looked at the documents in front of Margaret's chair, and then at the envelope in front of mine, and I could see her calculating. The calculation was quick. Whatever she concluded, she settled into a posture of contained confidence, which is Claudia's default position when she has decided she is in control of a situation. Martin Bell looked at his coffee. Margaret opened the session in the particular way that Margaret opens things, direct, factual, and at a pace that does not invite interruption. She thanked everyone for attending. She explained that the purpose of the meeting was to discuss amendments to the existing succession agreement for Whitmore Heritage Restorations. She said that Mr. Whitmore had requested certain modifications to the original framework, and that these modifications had been drafted and executed and were now in effect. She read the clause. I watched Simon's face as she read. He was listening carefully. He is his mother's son in that way. He listens with his whole face, taking in what is being said, rather than preparing his response in parallel. At the point where Margaret read the 3-year operational requirement, something shifted in his expression. Not anger, not the defensive sharpening that I had been half prepared for, something quieter, and if I am reading my son's face correctly after 34 years, something that looked very much like shame. Claudia's face did not shift in the same way. It went through a different sequence. There was a moment of stillness that was not composure but its opposite, the stillness of a person recalibrating very fast. Then her chin came up slightly. Then she looked at Margaret with an expression of professional neutrality that cost her something to maintain. When Margaret finished reading, the room was quiet for several seconds. Claudia said, "I think it would be helpful to understand the reasoning behind these changes." I said, "I expect it would." She said, "Arthur." I said, "Claudia." There was a pause. She said, "If there is a concern about the succession timeline, we could have discussed that directly." I said, "I am fairly certain there were discussions happening that I was not included in." Martin Bell put down his cup. He did not look at anyone. Simon said, "Dad." He has not called me Dad rather than Arthur in approximately 10 years. The word sat in the room very quietly. Everyone heard it. I looked at my son. I said, "I was ready to give you the company, Simon. I was not ready to watch you bury your mother's name to make someone else feel important." The silence after that was the longest one of the morning. I did not say it cruelly. I want to be clear about that. I said it the way you say a true thing that needs to be said and that you have thought about carefully and chosen the right moment for. I said it looking at him. Not at Claudia. Not at Martin. At him. My son. The man whose face has his mother's coloring and his grandfather's jaw and the particular serious expression that means, if you know him well enough, that he is working something through. He looked at the table. He looked at his hands. Then he looked at me. He said, "I know." 2 words. I know. And in the particular quality of those 2 words, in the way he said them with his eyes on mine, rather than on Claudia, or on the window, or on anything else, I understood that the conversation we needed to have was not the one happening at this table. Claudia attempted several things in the minutes that followed. She was professional, and she was precise, and she tried 3 distinct approaches to the question of the clause's legal robustness, which Margaret addressed with equal precision and without any particular emotion. Claudia is not a stupid person. She understood by the end of the 3rd approach that the clause was what it was, and that the Eleanor Whitmore Foundation was a real and established entity, and that the mechanism for transfer was ironclad. She asked about the brand acquisition proposal. Not directly. She asked, in carefully constructed terms, about whether there was flexibility in the prohibition on investor discussions. Margaret said, "There is no flexibility in that clause. Any external sale discussion without Mr. Whitmore's written consent triggers the transfer mechanism." Claudia sat very still for a moment. I picked up the envelope from the table. I set it in front of her. I said, "I found this in the sample drawer. I believe it may have been left there by mistake." Claudia looked at the envelope. She did not touch it. I said, "I have not made a copy. I did not feel it was necessary." The room was very quiet. I said, "The documents inside are dated. The timeline they represent is informative." Claudia looked at the envelope for a long moment. Then she looked at me. And for the first time since I have known her, for the first and only time in 8 years of Sundays and company dinners and Christmas lunches, and the particular social choreography of being her husband's father, Claudia looked at me without the careful arrangement of her expression that she usually maintains. What I saw underneath it was not villainy. I want to be accurate about this because accuracy matters more to me than a satisfying story. What I saw was ambition and fear, and the particular desperation of someone who had built a plan carefully and watched it become suddenly uncertain. She is not a bad person in the simple sense. She is a person who wanted something and convinced herself that the wanting justified the method. I understand that. I do not excuse it. But I understand it. Martin Bell resigned his position as company accountant 3 days later. He sent a letter, which was correct of him. The letter acknowledged that he had been in discussions with the Bristol Group in a consultative capacity, and that he should have disclosed this conflict of interest to me directly. He apologized. His apology was genuine in tone, if not entirely adequate in substance. But I have known Martin for 11 years, and I chose to accept it as he intended it rather than as a legal document. I hired a new accountant in the second week of May, a woman from Wiltshire named Rosalind Harper, who came recommended by 3 separate people in the industry, and who, in our first meeting, asked exactly the right questions about the existing client archive in a tone that suggested she understood what it represented. I want to pause here and tell you something before we get to what happened with Simon. Because there are several of you watching this right now who are in situations where someone in your family has decided, without consulting you, what the next chapter of your life is going to look like, where someone has taken a decision that was yours to make and started moving pieces around a board you did not know you were on. If that is you, I want to say, you are not imagining it. Your instincts are right, and the answer is not to explode and not to collapse. The answer is to do what the work has always required. Look clearly, think precisely. Act from the center of what you actually value, not from the edge of what you are angry about. Drop your city or country in the comments. Tell me if you are still with me. Leave a like if this story has earned one. Subscribe for the next part because what I am about to tell you about Simon is the most important thing in the whole story, and I think some of you are going to need to hear it. Let me tell you about the things I had learned over the months before the Sunday lunch, not because they are dramatic in themselves, but because they are the kind of things that matter when you understand the full picture. I have told you about the quick answering of calls. I have told you about the language Claudia used around the company. I want to tell you about the specific ways in which the company had been quietly positioned over the previous year for a transition that I had not yet agreed to. The first positioning was in the client-facing materials. Claudia had proposed, approximately 14 months before the Sunday lunch, that the company website be updated. This is not an unusual thing to propose. The website was dated, and a refresh was reasonable. What was less reasonable, and what I had approved without fully examining its implications, was a change in the language on the About page. The original text described the company as founded by Arthur Whitmore in 1986, with a commitment to the preservation of Bath's Georgian and Regency architectural heritage. The updated text described the company as a heritage-inspired residential restoration specialist with a focus on high-quality contemporary results. The word founded had become established. The word preservation had become inspired. The word heritage had been moved from describing a commitment to describing an adjective. These changes had been made by a designer Claudia recommended. I had read the revised text and approved it without sitting with it long enough to hear what it was actually saying. The second positioning was in the client profile. Over the preceding 18 months, Simon had declined 2 contracts that would previously have been the kind of work we centered the year around, both involving complex historic door and joinery restoration for listed buildings, on the grounds that the margins were insufficient given current material costs. This is not entirely wrong as an argument. Material costs had increased, but the margins had always been lower on that category of work, and we had always taken it anyway, because that work is the reason the company exists. When Simon began applying strictly commercial criteria to which historic contracts to pursue, he was not making a business decision. He was making a different kind of decision entirely. He was beginning the process of changing what the company is, before anyone had agreed that it should change. The third positioning was the relationship with the Bristol Group. The document in the drawer was a preliminary framework. The relationship it represented was not preliminary. It had been in development for at least 8 months based on the correspondence references within it. The Bristol Group had been given information about the company's client archive, its annual revenue, its workshop premises, and its staff structure. They had been given this information by someone with access to all of it. That someone was not Martin Bell alone. Martin Bell was a consultant to the proposal, not its originator. I am going to be careful here about what I say and how I say it. I am not interested in constructing a case for a court. I am interested in telling you what I know and what it means. What I know is that the proposal existed, that it was specific, that it contained information only accessible from within the company, and that the handwritten note in the margin was written in a hand I recognized. What it means is that Claudia had been building this for a long time, longer than I initially estimated, and that building it required Simon's awareness, if not his full participation, in a way that I have spent considerable time since then trying to understand. Here is what I have concluded. And I offer this not as certainty, but as the best understanding I can construct. Simon did not originate this plan. He did not sit down and decide to facilitate the sale of his mother's company to a Bristol investment firm. What he did was allow. He allowed Claudia to lead. He allowed the process to develop. He did not say, "Stop." He did not call me and say, "There are conversations happening that you need to know about." He answered the telephone quickly, and he adjusted his napkin at the table, and he did not say a word when the toast was made. There is a type of complicity that is not active. It is the complicity of looking away, of deciding that the situation is too complicated to address directly, of trusting that someone else will manage it, or that it will somehow resolve without requiring you to choose. Simon chose that complicity, and he knew it. When he said "I know" across that table, what he was acknowledging was not just that he understood what I had said, he was acknowledging that he had known something for a long time and had chosen not to act on it. I do not think he is a bad man. I want to say that clearly. I think he is a man who loves his wife and was afraid of what it would cost him to oppose her, and who told himself a version of the story in which the outcome would be acceptable, in which the company would survive in some form, and the money would be better and he would be in charge of something, and everyone would eventually be fine. I think he was wrong about that, and I think, sitting at that table on the Tuesday morning, looking at his hands, he knew he was wrong about it. The specific thing I cannot forgive, if forgiveness is even the right framework for this, is not the plan itself. Plans are made from ambition, and that is human. The thing I cannot move past easily is the Sunday lunch, the constructed occasion, the invited witnesses, the toast that was designed to be heard by Judith and Martin and to create, in the social record, the impression that Arthur Whitmore had publicly and willingly indicated his readiness to step aside. That was not an accident. That was not Claudia being thoughtless. That was precise. And Simon was there. And Simon lifted his glass. And Simon did not say a word. I am working toward forgiveness. I want you to know that. Working toward it the way I work on a difficult section of panel, carefully and without rushing, because forcing it produces something false. But I am working toward it. Let me tell you about the weeks after the meeting. Claudia did not come to the company dinner in April. Simon attended, briefly, and spoke to me near the end of the evening in the way that you speak to someone with whom you have unfinished business and are not yet certain of the terms. He was polite and he was careful, and he asked how the circus panel job was coming along, and I told him it was finished and that the client had been pleased, and he nodded and looked at the room and looked back at me and said, "I need to talk to you properly." I said, "I know." He said, "Not here." I said, "Whenever you are ready." He came to the workshop on a Saturday morning 11 days later, without Claudia. He arrived at 9:30 and knocked on the door, which he has never done in his life before that morning, because it has always been his workshop as much as mine, and knocking was never required. The knock, I thought, cost him something. It was an acknowledgment of a line that had been crossed and of the uncertainty of what was on the other side of it. I opened the door. He was in old clothes, which surprised me, jeans and a work shirt I had not seen in years, something he must have kept at the back of a wardrobe. He looked tired in the particular way of someone who has not been sleeping properly. He said, "I wanted to ask you something." I stepped back and let him in. He walked into the workshop and looked at it the way you look at a room you have not been fully present in for a long time, taking in the details as if they are slightly different from what you remember, which they are, because rooms change slowly and the change accumulates. He said, "Will you show me how to do it?" From the beginning. I looked at him. He said, "I know it is a lot to ask. I know I don't deserve it, but I want to learn it the right way. If you'll still have me." The workshop was quiet. The morning light through the high windows, the smell of linseed and old stone. I went to the rack of tools. I selected a cabinet scraper. It is a simple tool, a flat rectangle of steel with a burnished edge, and in the hands of someone who does not know what they are doing, it seems to do nothing useful at all, and in the hands of someone who understands it, it produces a surface that no sandpaper can replicate. I handed it to him. His hands closed around it. His hands are like mine, I noticed again, with the particular small shock of recognition that comes from seeing your own body in someone else's. I said, "Start with that section of ash. Work with the grain, not across it, and do not press. Let the tool do the work." He looked at the piece. He looked at the tool. He set the scraper against the wood and began. He got it wrong twice. The third time, he got it right. I did not say anything either time. I let the wood tell him. We worked for 3 hours that morning, not talking much. The sound of tools and the sound of the city outside and the particular meditative quality of a workshop on a Saturday morning when there is nowhere else to be. At 12:30, I put the kettle on in the small kitchen and made 2 cups of tea. I brought them to the bench. I handed Simon his. He held it and looked at the work he had done, and I looked at it too. It was not perfect, but it was honest. You could see where he had been paying attention and where he had let his mind drift, and the wood showed both things clearly. I said, "Your mother restored that door, the one in the corner." He looked at the door. It is an early Georgian panel door in pine, painted so many times over its life that the layers of paint became part of the door's story, and Eleanor had spent 3 weekends in 1998 stripping it carefully back to the original surface and finding, underneath all of it, the original painted finish that someone had applied 250 years ago. She had preserved that finish, and it is still there, and the door still stands in the corner of the workshop because neither of us could quite bring ourselves to put it anywhere else. Simon looked at the door for a long time. He said, "I'm sorry, Dad." I said, "I know." He said, "I don't think I can fix what I did." I said, "You can't fix it. You can build something different over it. It's not the same thing, but it's still something." He looked at his cup. He said, "Claudia and I are having some conversations." I did not ask what conversations. It was not mine to ask. He said, "I told her I wasn't going to sign anything that transferred the name." I said, "I know." He said, "How did you know?" I said, "Because you're your mother's son as much as you're mine. You came to the right conclusion eventually. You just needed more time than I wanted to give you." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "The Eleanor Whitmore Foundation." I said, "Yes." He said, "Was that for her or for me?" I thought about it. I said, "Both. It was for both of you." He looked at the door again. He said, "She would have liked knowing her name was on it." I said, "She would have liked knowing that too." We finished our tea. He went back to the ash section and worked another hour. He was more patient with the second session, which is how it usually goes. The material teaches you if you let it. At 2:15, he said he had to go. He put on his jacket and looked at the work on the bench and then at me. He said, "Same time next week?" I said, "If you want." He said, "I want." He left. I stood in the workshop for a while after he went. The light was going the way March and April light goes in Bath, from gold to silver very quickly, the shadows in the workshop corners going soft, and then deep. I picked up the cabinet scraper he had been using. I set the edge and checked the burnish the way I always do before I put a tool away properly. The edge was slightly off from the way he had been holding it, but not badly. He had been listening to the material. That is where this part of the story ends. Not with a confrontation that resolved everything. Not with an apology that fixed what was broken. With a door in the corner of a workshop that Eleanor restored. With a cup of tea and a cabinet scraper, and the sound of a son saying "same time next week" and meaning it. And I want to stop here and say something to whoever has been with me through this entire second part. You gave this old man your time and your attention, and that is not a small thing. So tell me, where are you? What city? What country? Are you still with me? Leave that in the comments. Leave a like if this story has meant something. Subscribe for the next part, which is coming very soon, and which will take you through the final resolution, the fate of the company, the conversations with Claudia, and the day I walked to the Prior Park Road kitchen at 5 in the morning and stood for a long time looking at the blue cup, and understood, for the first time since Eleanor died, that the thing I had been protecting was still standing. The story is not finished, but the worst of it is behind us. Stay with me. I am almost home. There is a particular kind of mourning that comes after a man has made a serious decision. Not a loud mourning, not a mourning that announces itself with drama or significance. Just an ordinary mourning in which the light comes through the kitchen window in the same way it always does, and the kettle makes the same sound, and the blue cup sits on the shelf where it always sits. And yet everything in that mourning is different, because the man moving through it has changed overnight in some way that he cannot fully account for, but that his body already knows. I woke at 5:20 on the Thursday after I had signed the amended documents with Margaret. I lay in the bed for a few minutes in the dark, listening to Prior Park Road, which is not a silent street even at that hour. A delivery lorry somewhere on the hill. A blackbird, impossibly early, making its case in the garden. The particular sound of a city that is very old and very settled, and does not need anyone's permission to continue being itself. I got up. I made tea. I stood at the kitchen window and looked at the garden in the early dark, and thought about what I had done, and whether I had done it correctly. Not whether I should have done it. That question was settled. I was thinking about the execution, whether the language was precise enough, whether Margaret had captured everything I intended, whether there were angles I had not considered. This is the particular torture of the careful mind. Not doubt about the decision, doubt about the implementation. I have spent 40 years of professional life learning that the difference between a good outcome and a bad one is usually not the quality of the original intention, but the quality of the execution. A door can be correctly designed and incorrectly hung. A staircase can be correctly planned and incorrectly assembled. The vision must be matched by the craft. I had vision. I trusted Margaret's craft. But at 6:20 on a Thursday morning, standing in my kitchen with my tea in my garden and Eleanor's blue cup on the shelf, I went through the whole thing one more time. Every clause, every condition, every mechanism. And when I had gone through it completely, I concluded that it was correct, not perfect. There is no such thing as perfect in a situation like this, but correct. The right tool, correctly applied. The work would tell us what it needed. It had already started. I want to stop here for just a moment. I realize I have been talking for a long time now, and you have been with me through all of it, through the Sunday lunch, and the walk back across the bridge, and Eleanor's letter in the drawer, and the morning at Margaret's office, and the 3 days before I found what I found in the workshop. That is a long time to stay with an old man's story, so let me ask you where you are right now. Your city? Your state? Put it in the comments because I genuinely want to know. And what time is it where you are? Is it morning where you are, or is it late and you cannot sleep? There is always someone watching at a difficult hour who needed to find something like this. If that is you, I am glad you found it. Leave a like if this story is sitting somewhere real in you. And subscribe for daily stories because there is something new here every single day. Now let me keep going, because the next part of this is where everything starts to become very clear. The Thursday passed in the workshop. I had a client meeting in the afternoon, a property on Lansdowne Crescent where the owner wanted a consultation on the original shutters in the drawing room. She was a woman of perhaps 70, very precise, with the particular quality of someone who has spent a long life paying serious attention to things. She showed me the shutters, and I looked at them carefully, and we talked about what they needed and what was possible, and what was worth doing and what was not. She offered me tea, which I accepted, and we sat in the drawing room for 20 minutes, talking about nothing in particular: the history of the building, the quality of the light in winter versus summer, the peculiar difficulty of finding tradespeople who understood that a building of this age was a document as much as a structure. It was exactly the conversation I needed. Not because it distracted me, because it reminded me what I was protecting. Not an abstraction, not a financial asset or a legal entity. These rooms, these shutters, this woman who cared enough to make certain that the things she was responsible for were looked after correctly. This is what the company does. This is what it is for. This is what was at stake when Simon sat at that table and moved his fork and said nothing. I drove back to the workshop through the late afternoon and worked another 2 hours on the circus panel, and then put everything away and locked up and went home. On the Friday, Margaret called to confirm that all documentation was filed and in order. She gave me the date for the formal meeting, which she had communicated to Simon's office through the correct channels. She said Simon's solicitor had acknowledged receipt. She said Simon's solicitor had asked about the nature of the meeting. She said she had responded that it was a routine succession discussion and that no specific preparation was required beyond what had already been requested. I said, "Good." She said, "Arthur, are you sleeping?" I said, "Adequately." She said, "That is not the same as yes." I said, "I know." "Thank you, Margaret." She said, "Call me if anything develops before Tuesday." I said I would. I sat with the phone in my hand for a moment after we finished. Margaret Henshaw has been in my life for 17 years, the last 11 of them as my solicitor, and all 17 of them as a person who knew Eleanor and who has therefore always treated me with a specific quality of care that goes beyond the professional. She knows what I built, and she knows what it cost, and she knows what Eleanor was to all of it. When she asked if I was sleeping, she was not asking a clinical question. She was asking the other question underneath it, the one that people who love you ask when they want to know if you are still holding. I am still holding. That was my answer to the question under the question. I did not say it out loud, but it was the answer. The Saturday and Sunday passed quietly. I worked on Saturday morning and spent the afternoon driving out to Lecoq, which I sometimes do on days when I need to think without interruption. There is a quality of light in the Wiltshire countryside on a March afternoon that is unlike any other light I know. Something about the pale gold against the gray and the bare trees and the particular silence of fields that are resting between one year's work and the next. I parked near the Abbey and walked for an hour and thought about nothing specific and everything general, which is the particular quality of a useful walk. Sunday. I attended the morning service at the church I have attended, without great consistency but without entirely abandoning it for 30 years. The rector, a man named Thatcher who has been there for 12 of those years, shook my hand at the door and asked how I was keeping, and I said well enough, and he nodded in the way that men nod when they understand that well enough is carrying more weight than it usually does, but they are too respectful to press. I sat in the third pew from the back on the left side, which is where I have sat since Eleanor and I chose it together on the second Sunday after we moved to Prior Park Road in 1989. She sat to my right. The seat to my right has been empty for 6 years. I have not moved to the middle of the pew or the other end. I sit where I have always sat, and the space to my right is Eleanor's space and always will be. The sermon was about patience. Whether this was coincidence or the rector's particular sensitivity to what his congregation was carrying on any given Sunday, I cannot say. What I know is that I listened with more attention than I usually bring to a Sunday sermon, and that what I heard made sense to me in the specific terms of the specific week I was living through. The patience that faith asks of us is not the passive waiting of someone who has given up. It is the active patience of someone who understands that the right moment has not yet arrived and is making themselves ready for when it does. There is work to do in the waiting. There is preparation and clarity in the particular discipline of not moving too soon or in the wrong direction. I thought about Eleanor. I thought about the 40 years of the company and the particular patience that craft demands. I thought about the amended clause in the Tuesday meeting and Simon's face when the Brindisi was made. And I thought about what I wanted to come out of all of it. Not the destruction of anyone. Not the satisfaction of being proven right. Something simpler and more difficult. The continuation of what was built, and the chance, if it was still possible, that my son might become the man I had always believed he could be. Monday was the day before the meeting, and I spent it in the workshop doing careful work on a section of carved cornice that had been waiting 3 weeks for my full attention. Carved work requires a quality of focus that excludes other thoughts, which is partly why I had been putting it off. Your hands must know what they are doing so thoroughly that your mind is free to be fully present in the work. You cannot be in 2 places at once with carved work. The wood will tell you. I was in one place. I was in the workshop with the cornice and the tools and the smell of the old wood and the light through the high windows. I worked for 4 hours without stopping, and the section came right. And I put the tools away and stood back and looked at it and felt the particular satisfaction of work well executed. That evening I sat at the kitchen table, and I wrote, by hand in a plain notebook, the single sentence I intended to say to Simon if the moment arose and the moment was right. I wrote it several ways and crossed each version out until I had the version that was true and precise and contained no anger and no performance and no excess. I wrote it in the notebook, and I left the notebook on the table and I went to bed. At 8:30 the next morning, I put on the jacket I wear for professional meetings, the dark gray one that Eleanor chose at a shop on Milsom Street in 2011. And that still fits and still looks correct. I checked my reflection in the hallway mirror for a moment, which I do not usually do. The face looking back at me was recognizable, a bit more worn than I would have chosen, but recognizable. Still the face of the man who built something, still the face of someone who was not finished yet. I walked out to the car. The morning was cool and clear with a thin frost on the pavement still melting in the 7 o'clock sun. The Abbey Tower was visible at the end of the road, pale and steady as it always is. I have seen that tower from various points in this city for 60 years, from when my grandmother brought me to Bath as a small boy to stand in the nave and look up, to the various decades of living here and working here and raising a family here. It does not change. That is the point of it. It has been standing in that particular pale stone for 5 centuries, and it intends to stand for 5 more, and it does not need anyone's permission or approval to keep doing so. I thought about that as I started the car. The things that stand because they were built correctly and maintained with care. The things that can withstand the particular pressures that time and circumstance apply because they were made to withstand them. That is not arrogance. That is simply the honest accounting of what good work produces. I drove to Walcott Street. The others arrived within 7 minutes of each other. Martin Bell first, at 2 minutes to 9, in his car rather than walking as he usually does from the office at the other end of the street. He looked as if he had not been sleeping particularly well either. He accepted coffee with slightly more gratitude than usual, and sat at the far end of the table from where he normally sits. Margaret arrived precisely on time, which is to say at 9 o'clock exactly, which is the only time Margaret Henshaw arrives at anything. She set her briefcase down and arranged her documents with the particular care she takes with everything and nodded at me across the table. Simon and Claudia came in together at 4 minutes past 9. Simon held the door. Claudia entered first. She was in the slate jacket, the one I described before, and her hair was arranged precisely. She moved through the doorway with the particular quality she always has, the occupying of space, the subtle establishment of presence before a word is spoken. Simon closed the door behind them. He looked at me when he came in. Not at the documents or at Margaret or at the room. At me. His expression was the serious one, the one that belongs to his mother, and underneath it there was something I had not seen in a very long time. He looked afraid, not the performance of concern, not the managed expression of a man who has decided in advance what face to show. He looked genuinely afraid, and I understood looking at him that this was not the fear of someone who had been caught. It was the fear of someone who had been watching a situation develop for months and had not been able to make himself do what he knew he should do, and who understood that the moment had now arrived regardless. I understood that fear. I wished I did not have to be the cause of it, but I understood it. Claudia sat. Simon sat. Martin Bell looked at his coffee. Margaret opened her folder. She said what I told you she said. She read the clause. I watched the faces around the table. When she finished, the silence that followed was one of the more specific silences I have experienced in my life. Each person in the room was processing what they had heard in a manner entirely their own. Martin Bell continued to look at his coffee. Simon had his mother's stillness, the complete physical quiet of a person whose mind is moving very fast. Claudia had gone to that particular place of calculation that I had seen before and that was now, in this context, visible to me with a clarity it had not previously had. Claudia said what I told you she said. She asked about the reasoning, and I gave her the answer I gave her. She said my name, and I said hers, and we looked at each other across the table, in the particular way that two people look at each other when they are not pretending about anything for the first time. Then I picked up the envelope and I set it in front of her. I said what I told you I said about finding the document in the sample drawer and believing it had been left there by mistake. The room was very quiet when I set the envelope down. Claudia looked at it for a long time without touching it. I said I had not made a copy because I did not feel it was necessary. I said the documents inside were dated and that the timeline they represented was informative. Claudia looked at the envelope and then she looked at me, and I have already told you what I saw underneath the arrangement of her expression in that moment. I told you it was not villainy in the simple sense, and I told you it was ambition and fear and the desperation of someone watching a careful plan become suddenly uncertain. All of that was true. But there was something else too. She was surprised. Not by the existence of the document. She knew it existed. She was surprised that I had it. She was surprised that I had possessed it, quietly, for the days between finding it and sitting down at this table, and had not confronted her with it immediately. She had expected the confrontation to happen on her timeline, at a moment she chose, in a way that could be managed. She had not expected the document to arrive here, at a table with a solicitor and a formal amended clause already signed and in place, as a quiet addition to what had already been accomplished. She understood in that moment that she had made an error. Not one error. A series of them, going back to the fundamental error of assuming that because a man was old and grieving and occupied with his craft, he was not paying attention. That was the mistake. That is always the mistake. Martin Bell resigned 3 days later. I told you that. What I did not tell you was what happened between the closing of the Tuesday meeting and the arrival of his letter. On the Tuesday evening, after the meeting, I sat in the workshop alone for 2 hours. I had sent everyone else home. The building was quiet in the particular way it gets after 5 in the afternoon in March. The street sounds outside, softened by the stone walls, the workshop itself taking on the quality of a room that has been used for serious things, and is resting from them. I sat on the stool at the end of the bench where I sit when I am thinking rather than working. Eleanor used to call it the thinking stool. She was right, as she usually was about specific things. I sat on the thinking stool and I looked at the workshop and I thought about what had just happened and what was going to happen now. The legal situation was clear. Margaret was handling it. The clause was in place. The Bristol group had been informed through the correct channel and in the correct language that the transaction they had been discussing with parties claiming to represent Whitmore Heritage Restorations had no legal foundation and would expose them to specific liabilities if they proceeded. That conversation had happened before the Tuesday meeting, on the Friday, which is why Claudia's expression when she sat down at the table on Tuesday had something in it beyond simple calculation. She had already received, through channels I will not fully specify here, an indication that the Bristol engagement was no longer viable. What I was thinking about on the thinking stool was not the legal situation. I was thinking about Simon. I want you to understand what it is to sit in a room you built and think about your son. Not the man who sat at that table and moved his napkin and said nothing when the brindisi was made. Not the professional who had begun, quietly and incrementally, to move the company away from what it was toward something easier to sell. The boy who used to do his homework on the end of that bench. The young man who came to the workshop on the day I told him his mother had gone to the doctor and the results were not good, and who sat on the thinking stool for 3 hours while I worked nearby because neither of us could be alone with it. The man who stood in the hospital corridor on the Tuesday morning in February 6 years ago and held my arm and did not say anything at all because there was nothing to say, and he knew it. That is my son. Those are not separate from the man who sat at the table on Sunday. They are the same person. And I am his father, which is a permanent condition regardless of what any of us has done or failed to do. I sat on the thinking stool for 2 hours. When I left, I locked the workshop and drove home and made soup and ate it at the kitchen table and went to bed at 9:30. The days that followed the meeting were not quiet in the external sense. There were telephone calls and correspondence, and the particular careful work of Margaret and her office that goes on in the background of these situations. And that requires very little of me beyond the occasional confirmation and the occasional signature. The Eleanor Whitmore Foundation for Heritage Craft was formally established. The amended succession agreement was registered in the correct form. I met with Rosalind Harper, the new accountant, who came to the workshop for 2 hours and sat at the conference table and asked exactly the kind of questions that told me she understood what she was looking at. I want to pause here, because what I have been describing for the last while is the external movement of things, the legal and professional developments, and those matter, but they are not the main thing I want to tell you. The main thing is what was happening inside the situation, what was happening between me and my son, which was not happening quickly or cleanly or in the way that narrative convenience might prefer. Let me tell you about the fortnight between the Tuesday meeting and the Saturday morning that Simon knocked on the workshop door. He called me on the Wednesday. I answered on the 3rd ring. He said, "Dad." I said, "Simon." There was a pause that went on for perhaps 4 seconds, which is a very long time in a telephone conversation when both parties are listening hard. He said, "I need to think." I said, "I know." He said, "Will you give me a few days?" I said, "I am not going anywhere." He did not call on Thursday or Friday. On Saturday I was in the workshop, and on Sunday I went to church and sat in the 3rd pew from the back, and the seat to my right was empty as it always is, and I thought about patience, and about the things that cannot be rushed, and about the particular quality of love that a parent carries for a child. Even when that child has done something, the parent cannot entirely forgive. He called on the Monday morning. He said, "Can we meet?" I said, "Of course." He said, "Not at the workshop, not yet." I said, "Wherever you like." He said, "The garden at the Holborn." I said, "Yes." The garden at the Holborn Museum sits at the eastern end of Great Pulteney Street, which is the same street where Simon and Claudia live, a detail I noted without mentioning. The garden is not large, but it is carefully maintained, and in March the early bulbs were already through the ground. And there was a quality to the morning that was the specific quality of a winter that has decided to become something else. I arrived first. I sat on one of the stone benches near the central path and waited. A museum attendant was unlocking the rear entrance. 2 women were walking through the garden with a small dog. The Pulteney Bridge was audible in the distance, the particular sound of the weir that I have been hearing from various points in this city for most of my life. Simon came through the gate at 10 minutes to 11. He was in his work jacket, a dark green thing he has had for years, and he had his hands in his pockets, and he walked toward me without looking around the garden, directly toward me, which told me something. He sat on the bench next to me. We both looked at the garden for a moment without speaking. He said, "I did not know about the Bristol document. I want you to know that." I said, "I believe you." He said, "I knew about the conversations. I knew Claudia had been talking to people. I told myself it was preliminary, that nothing had been decided, that there would be a conversation with you before anything moved forward." I said, "But you did not make sure of that." He said, "No." The garden was quiet. The museum attendant had gone inside. The 2 women with the dog had moved to the far end near the hedge. I said, "Simon, when did you stop feeling like you were allowed to disagree with her?" He was quiet for a while, long enough that a pigeon landed on the path in front of us and conducted its investigation of the gravel and departed, finding nothing of interest. He said, "I'm not sure I can answer that." I said, "I am not asking for a date. I am asking because I think that is the thing, not what happened with the company. That is a consequence. The thing is that somewhere along the way you decided that the cost of disagreeing was higher than the cost of going along. And everything else followed from that." He looked at his hands. He has my hands, large and long-fingered, though his are not as calloused as mine because he did not spend decades at a workbench. He looked at his hands, and he did not say anything for another long moment. He said, "She is very certain about things." I said, "I know. He said, "It is difficult to hold your own ground against someone who is that certain." I said, "It is, but your ground is yours. It does not belong to the person who is most certain in the room." He looked at me. He said, "You made her quite angry." I said, "I expect I did." He said, "She is talking about legal options." I said, "Margaret can handle that conversation. That is what I pay her for." "But Simon, before we talk about any of that, I need to ask you something directly." He said, "All right." I said, "Is there any part of you that still believes selling the company was the right thing to do?" He looked at the garden. He looked at the pale gold stone of the museum building and the early bulbs coming up through the damp earth and the particular quality of the morning light. He said, "No, there never was. I just did not know how to stop it." I sat with that for a moment. I said, "That is where we start then." Now I need to stop here and say something directly to whoever is watching this, because I think there are people listening right now who have had a version of this conversation, not necessarily about a company, about a marriage, about a friendship, about a child, about some situation in their life where the person they love made a wrong turn and they could see it, and they could not figure out how to say the true thing without losing something they could not afford to lose. If you have been there, you know the particular ache of the garden bench conversation. You know the particular difficulty of holding both the love and the honest accounting of what went wrong. So where are you? What city? What state? Drop it in the comments, because I want to know who is out there with me on this. And if this story is speaking to something in your own life, leave a like. Share it with someone who might need it. Subscribe for daily stories. There is something new here every single day. And let me keep going, because what happens in the weeks after that garden bench conversation is where the real work begins. The weeks that followed were not straightforward. I want to be honest about that because I think it would be dishonest and, in a specific way, disrespectful to tell you that things resolved themselves smoothly and cleanly after the Tuesday meeting and the garden bench conversation. They did not. There was the legal noise that Claudia had indicated was coming, which Margaret handled with the efficiency and the lack of drama that are her two best professional qualities. There were difficult conversations between Simon and Claudia that I was not party to, and that I only know about in the partial and oblique way that you know about anything your adult child is living through when they tell you pieces of it without telling you everything. There was the process which Martin Bell's departure required of restructuring the company accounts and establishing new arrangements with Rosalind Harper. There was the ongoing work, which I mention because it is the thing that kept me anchored through all of it. The circus panel, the Lansdowne Crescent shutters, a new commission that came in from a Georgian terrace in Camden Crescent, where the entire ground floor joinery needed a careful assessment and potentially several months of work. The work is where I live. It always has been. When the work is going right, I am most fully myself. This is something Eleanor understood from the very beginning, and something that Simon, for all his complexity and his present difficulties, also understands. He grew up in that workshop. He knows what it means to see a man at his bench at 7 in the morning, not because anyone told him to be there, but because that is where he needs to be. That understanding, underneath everything else, is what I was counting on. There is a particular thing that happens in a family when the truth has been said and acknowledged. Not forgiveness, not yet, and not the restoration of everything to what it was before, because that is not available, and pretending otherwise would be sentimental in the worst way. What happens is a clearing, a quality of space that was not there before. The accumulated weight of the unsaid thing lifts, not easily and not completely, but perceptibly. You can feel the room breathe differently. I felt that in the weeks after the garden bench conversation. Simon called more often, not with the anxious prompt answering of the months before, but with something more ordinary. He called because he wanted to talk about the Camden Crescent Commission, which he had been involved in quoting. He called because he wanted to understand something about the new accounting arrangements. He called once on a Tuesday evening, apparently for no particular reason at all, and we talked for 20 minutes about nothing much and then said good night, and that was that. The calls themselves were not the thing. The quality of them was the thing, the return of something I had been missing for longer than I had admitted to myself. I want to be precise about what I mean when I say that, because I do not want to sentimentalize it. Simon and I have never been a demonstrative father and son. We are not men who say the large things easily or who express affection in the direct, uncomplicated ways that some families manage. What we have always had is something underneath the words, a quality of attention and respect that runs through even the most ordinary conversation, an understanding, not spoken, of what the other person is carrying and what they need and what they can be trusted with. That quality had been absent for the better part of a year before the Sunday lunch. I had noticed its absence and attributed it to the ordinary distance of adult family life, to the busyness and the particular pressures of Simon's professional situation. I had explained it to myself in the ways you explain things when the true explanation is one you are not quite ready to examine. What I understood now, with the clarity that comes after the fact, is that the quality had been absent because Simon had been carrying something he could not share with me, and the carrying of it had put a particular kind of glass between us. He could see me clearly. I could see him clearly. But we could not quite reach each other through it. The glass was gone now. That was what I felt in the calls. That was what I felt more than anything in the particular ordinary quality of a Tuesday evening call that was about nothing in particular, and therefore about everything. There is a specific kind of courage required to maintain composure in a long and difficult situation that requires patience rather than immediate action. I want to talk about this because I think it is something that gets left out of the accounts people give of situations like this. Everyone understands the courage of the confrontation. Everyone understands the courage of the dramatic moment, the standing up, the speaking clearly, the refusal to be moved. What people talk about less is the courage required in the long middle, the weeks and months of waiting while legal processes move at their own pace, the days of ordinary work while something is being decided that matters enormously, the Tuesday mornings in the workshop when you are fitting a section of cornice and the question of what is happening to your family is somewhere at the back of your mind constantly, and you have to make the choice, repeatedly and deliberately, not to let it drag you out of the present moment and away from the work that your hands and your clients and your company need you to be present for. That courage is unglamorous. It does not make for dramatic storytelling. But it is the thing, in my experience, that separates the outcomes. The people who prevail in long, difficult situations are not always the most intelligent or the most resourceful or the most righteous. They are the ones who can sustain their attention and their discipline across the full length of time the situation requires. They do not burn out in the early confrontations. They do not collapse in the long middle. They are still standing, still clear, still working when the moment of resolution arrives. I want to say something about Martin Bell here, because I have not given him quite the attention he deserves in this account, and because his story is part of what I am describing. Martin Bell came to me in person on the Thursday, 2 days after his letter arrived. He did not call first. He simply appeared at the workshop at 10:30 in the morning, in his professional clothes, looking as if he had not slept in several nights, which I suspect he had not. I let him in and made tea, and we sat at the conference table. He said, "I want to explain." And then he said, "I also want to say that I know an explanation is not the same as an excuse." I said, "Go ahead." He told me about it. Not in full detail, but in enough detail. The Bristol group had approached him approximately 10 months before the Tuesday meeting through a professional contact who had worked with both him and them on previous unrelated engagements. They had presented the acquisition as a straightforward commercial proposition and had represented, in the early conversations, that Arthur Whitmore was aware of and broadly supportive of the idea of a succession involving external investment. Martin had not verified this. He had not picked up the telephone and asked me directly. He had told himself that it was not his place to interfere in a family decision that had apparently already been made. He had accepted a consulting role that was not especially well remunerated, and that he now understood had been offered partly to secure his cooperation and partly to ensure his silence. He had not shared this with me because, as he said, and here his voice had a quality of genuine shame that I believed, he had not wanted to be the person who told me that my son's wife was selling my company out from under me. He had told himself that it was none of his business. He had told himself that the family would sort it out. He had answered my calls quickly and corrected himself on the telephone and had gone home every evening for 10 months with the knowledge sitting in him like a stone. I listened to all of it. When he was done, I looked at him for a moment. I said, "Martin, you have been my accountant for 11 years. In 11 years you have always given me accurate information and honest counsel. That is a record I am not going to discard entirely because of 10 months of a decision I understand even if I cannot entirely excuse." He said, "I am still resigning." I said, "I know, and you should, but I wanted you to hear that I understand the position you were in, and I believe that your original motivation was not malicious." He said, "It was cowardly." I said, "Yes, but cowardice and malice are different things, and the difference matters." He left a few minutes later. I do not know what he will do now. He is a capable accountant and will find other clients. Whether he carries the lesson of these 10 months with him, whether the specific experience of realizing that looking away from a difficult thing does not make the difficult thing go away, is something only he can determine. I hope he does. He is not a bad man. He made a series of choices that compounded into a serious mistake, and when the accounting came, he accepted it without argument. In my experience, that is worth something. Now, here is something I want to say to you before we go further. We are somewhere in the middle of this story now, the place where the major events have happened and the decisions have been made, and what is left is the particular work of consequence and rebuilding. This is the part of the story that often gets shortened in the telling because it does not have the same dramatic shape as the confrontations and the revelations. But I think this is the most important part, because it is here, in the unglamorous middle, that the real question gets answered. Not whether justice was done, whether anything was saved. So let me ask you one more time. Where are you right now? Your city, your state? Drop it in the comments. And I want to ask something else. Is there someone in your life right now who you have been avoiding a difficult conversation with because the conversation would cost something you are afraid to pay? I am not asking you to answer me. I am asking you to sit with the question for a moment, because one of the things I learned from everything I am telling you is that the conversations we delay do not actually become less necessary with time. They just accumulate interest. They get heavier, and the day you finally have them is harder for the postponement. Leave a like if this story is landing somewhere. Subscribe for daily stories, because there is something new here every single day. And let me take you to the part of the story that happened in the workshop on a Saturday morning, which is where everything that had broken began, very slowly and very honestly, to become something different. I have described that Saturday morning already. Simon's knock on the door, the old clothes, the tiredness in his face, the question he asked, which was, "Will you show me how to do it?" from the beginning. What I have not described is what happened inside me when he asked that question. I have spent 40 years learning to read the intention in a request before I respond to it. When a client asks me to look at a piece of work and tell them what it needs, I am listening not just for the stated question, but for the actual question underneath it. What do they really want to know? What are they actually asking? Sometimes the stated question and the actual question are the same. More often they are not. When Simon asked me to show him how to do it from the beginning, the stated request was about craft, about learning to work with wood, about understanding the work that the company was built on. All of that was real and all of that mattered. But the actual question underneath it was something different. The actual question was, is it still possible? Not the company, not the succession. Those are legal and professional matters, and they are being handled. The question was whether it was still possible between us, father and son, whether the glass that had been there for the better part of a year, and perhaps, if I was honest, for a great deal longer than that, could come down completely, whether we could get back to something real. That was the question I heard when he stood in the doorway of the workshop in his old clothes with his hands in his pockets, looking like a man who had decided to try something honest. My answer was the cabinet scraper. I picked it up from the tool rack and I handed it to him, and I told him to start with the ash section and to work with the grain, and not to press, but to let the tool do the work. I did not say yes to the larger question directly. I did not need to. The cabinet scraper was the answer. The cabinet scraper was, I am still here. The cabinet scraper was, this can still be taught and learned. The cabinet scraper was, begin. He worked. He got it wrong twice and right the third time, and I did not say anything either time because the wood was saying what needed to be said. We worked for 3 hours, and then I made tea and handed him his cup, and we stood at the bench and looked at what he had done. I said, your mother restored that door, the one in the corner. He looked at the door for a long time. I have told you what he said. I want to add something I did not tell you before. When he looked at that door, when he turned away from the bench and looked at the early Georgian panel door that Eleanor spent 3 weekends on in 1998, something happened in his face that I have not seen since he was a much younger man. Something settled. Something that had been held tense in him for a long time released slightly, the way a piece of wood releases when you have been working it correctly, and it finally gives itself to what it is meant to be. He looked at his mother's door and he said he was sorry. I said I knew. He said he did not think he could fix what he had done. I said you cannot fix it, but you can build something different over it, that it is not the same thing, but it is still something. Then he asked about the Eleanor Whitmore Foundation. He said, was that for her or for me? I thought about it, and I said both, for both of you. And he said she would have liked knowing her name was on it. And I said she would have liked knowing that too. We finished our tea, and he went back to the ash and worked another hour, and then he said he had to go, and he put on his jacket and looked at the work, and then at me and said, same time next week. I said, if you want. He said, I want. He left. Simon heard all of that. I know he heard all of that because of what he said afterward, and because of what he has done in the months since. There is a particular thing that happens in a relationship when the truth is finally said between two people who have been speaking around it for a long time. Not an argument, not a confrontation in the sense of combat, a statement, a clear and unambiguous naming of what is. When the truth is said in that way, it changes the ground the relationship stands on, not by destroying something, by making what was unstable suddenly stable, because the instability was always the unspoken thing. And now that the unspoken thing has been spoken, the ground is solid. That is what happened in the conference room on Walcott Street between me and my son. He heard what I said. He said, I know. And in the specific quality of those 2 words, which I have described to you already, I heard that the ground had changed. Not that everything was resolved. Not that the damage was undone. But that the ground was solid again, and that what we built on it from here would be built on truth rather than on the comfortable avoidance of it. I have been thinking in the months since about what I want to say to you about family, because family is the center of this story, and I have been circling around some things that I want to say directly now. Family is not an argument for surrender. I think this is the thing I most want you to understand. There is a version of the idea of family loyalty that requires you to absorb harm silently, because the person causing the harm is related to you or related to someone you love. There is a version of the idea of not causing drama that means you watch what you built be dismantled because raising your voice would create an uncomfortable scene. There is a version of keeping the peace that means letting the peace be kept at the expense of justice and truth and the things you know to be right. I am not interested in that version of family, and Eleanor was not interested in it either. That is what she meant when she wrote that a business of family only valued the name on the plaque if the family still knew how to respect it. She was not talking about sentiment, she was talking about something structural. A family that cannot be honest with itself about what is happening within it is not a family that is going to protect the things that matter. It is a family that is going to lose them one by one while everyone talks about how important they are. Protecting what matters sometimes means saying the true thing at the cost of the comfortable arrangement. It means sitting across a table from your son and saying the thing that needs to be said, even when saying it is going to crack something open between you that may take a long time to heal. It means going to the solicitor in the morning rather than absorbing the indignity in silence, because you do not want to make trouble. It means creating the conditions under which the truth can become visible rather than remaining in the comfortable dark where the people who benefit from the darkness want it to stay. That is not a violation of family. That is the most serious act of loyalty to family that I know, and I say that as a man who loves his son, who loved his wife with everything he had for nearly 40 years, who is sitting here now with the knowledge that what was built is still standing, and that there is a young person from Twerton in the workshop learning to listen to old wood, and that Simon comes on Saturdays, and that Eleanor's door is still in the corner, and that the foundation that carries her name has made its first commitment, and that the light in Bath in late May comes through the kitchen window in the way it always has and always will. There is one more thing I want to tell you, about the blue cup. On a morning in June, about 3 weeks after The Apprentice began, I was in the kitchen making the morning tea, and I reached up to the shelf for the blue cup. Not the plain brown cup that I habitually use. The blue cup, Eleanor's cup with the chip on the handle that she always preferred. I stood there with it for a moment. I turned it over in my hands, the way I have turned thousands of pieces of work over the years, feeling for what it was telling me. The chip was where it always is, on the left side of the handle, the exact shape of a small irregularity that 40 years of use had made into something more like a characteristic than a flaw. I made the tea and I poured it into the blue cup, and I carried it to the sitting room, and I sat in the chair where the morning light falls on the left arm, and I drank Eleanor's tea from Eleanor's cup, and I looked at the garden, and I said nothing at all. I have not been able to explain fully why I chose that morning to do what I had not done in 6 years. I have thought about it and I have some ideas, but none of them feel entirely complete. What I know is that it did not feel like a violation of anything. It felt like the opposite of a violation. It felt like continuing a conversation that had been on pause. Eleanor and I talked every morning over tea, not always about important things. Sometimes about the garden or something we had read, or something that had happened at the workshop. Sometimes about the children when they were young, something one of them had said or done that had amused or worried us. Sometimes just sitting together in the way that long married people sit together, not requiring the conversation to be about anything in particular, because the companionship itself is the point. I sat in the chair with the blue cup and I thought, I think we did all right, Eleanor. I think the thing we built is going to keep standing. Not perfectly. Not without the marks of everything it has been through, but standing and honest about what it is, and in the hands of people who are beginning to understand what it is for. I did not hear an answer. I have been a man of uncertain faith at various times in my life, and I'm not going to claim a supernatural experience for the sake of a satisfying story. But there was something in the quality of the morning that felt, for a few minutes, like the particular companionable silence that I knew for 40 years and have been missing for 6. I finished the tea. I washed the cup carefully and set it back on the shelf above the kettle, and I went to work. Now I want to come to the end of this. Not because I have run out of things to say. I suspect I could sit here for considerably longer than is reasonable and keep talking, but because the things that are most essential have been said, and what remains is to say them in the right way. I am 58 years old. I have been building things since I was young enough to call myself properly young. I have had one great love. I have had one son. I have had one company. I have had one address on Walcott Street in Bath, England, and one modest house on Prior Park Road, and one kitchen, where one blue cup lives on one shelf, and one workshop where Eleanor's door stands in the corner, and the light comes through the high windows in the morning. I have not been the man I wanted to be at every moment of my life. That would be an extraordinary claim, and I have no interest in extraordinary claims. I have been too absorbed in the work to be fully present in the family at certain critical moments. I have been too certain of my own judgment at times when more humility would have served everyone better. I have been slow to say certain things that needed saying, and I have paid the price for that slowness in ways that I still carry. But I have not been dishonest. I have not been careless with what was entrusted to me. I have not been the man who looked away from the difficult thing because looking at it was inconvenient. And when the particular test of this last year arrived, when the Brindisi was made, and the silence held, and the discovery was found in the sample drawer, and the truth became unavoidable, I did not become someone I would not recognize in the morning. I was still the man who read old wood for what it needed, who listened to the material rather than forcing it into a predetermined shape, who used the right tool for the right job with the patience that the job required, who built the thing that needed to be built and let the work tell him what was necessary. That is all I know how to do, and it turns out that is enough. I want to say something to the specific people who have been listening to this today, not as a category but as individuals, because I believe that the people who find a story like this are people who needed something specific from it. If you are a father who has built something over a lifetime and who is beginning to feel the particular pressure of being seen as old before your time, I want you to hear this. Your experience is not a liability. It is not the thing they want to call it when they want to move you out of the way. Your decades of paying attention and making mistakes and learning from them and doing the work honestly and staying when it was difficult and adjusting when you were wrong are the most valuable thing you have. Do not let anyone persuade you that the accumulated weight of a life lived carefully is somehow less valuable than the bright, confident certainty of someone who has not yet been tested by time. If you are the adult child of a man like me, someone who has had to watch a parent fight a battle that they did not ask you to take part in, and that cost them things you only partly understand, I want to say this: it is not too late. Whatever distance exists, whatever the difficult thing is that has not yet been said, the door of that workshop is never permanently closed. The man who knocks on it in his old clothes is always going to be let in. The question is only whether you can find the courage to knock. If you are in the middle of the exact situation I was in, if you are carrying knowledge that nobody else in your family will acknowledge, if you are being dismissed as confused or difficult or past your time, if you have found something you were not supposed to find and you do not yet know what to do with it, I want to say to you what I needed someone to say to me during those months. You are not imagining it. Your instincts are not the product of age or grief or loneliness or any of the other convenient explanations that people reach for when they do not want to deal with what you are telling them. Go to the professional you trust. Document everything. Move before they expect you to move. And do not mistake composure for weakness. The quietest response is often the most effective one. And if you are simply someone who found this story today because the algorithm brought it to you, and you stayed, because something in it resonated, something in the shape of it, that reminded you of someone you know, or something you have been carrying yourself, then I want to say thank you. Thank you for staying. Thank you for the quality of attention you gave to an old man's account of a difficult year. That attention is a gift, and I do not take it lightly. The workshop on Walcott Street is still open. The sign still says Whitmore Heritage Restorations. The name on the door is still the name I put on it in 1986 when I was 32 years old, and terrified, and absolutely certain that this was the right thing to do. Eleanor's door is still in the corner. The foundation that carries her name has made its first commitment to the next person who wants to learn this work and keep it alive. Simon comes on Saturday mornings, same time, every week. The blue cup is on the shelf. The light in bath in late May comes through the kitchen window and makes the honeystone glow as if it has been storing warmth all winter and is only now releasing it, which in a way it has been, and in a way it always will be. Some things, if they are made well enough and cared for honestly and defended when they need to be defended, outlast almost everything that is thrown at them. I am still standing. Now, before I let you go, I need to ask you something one final time. I need to know if you were really here, not just watching, really here, with Arthur Whitmore of Bath, England, on Prior Park Road and Walcott Street, and the Pulteney Bridge, and Judith's Kitchen in Twerton, and Margaret Henshaw's office at Queen Square, and the library in Bethampton, and the garden at the Holborn Museum, and the workshop on a Saturday morning when a man who almost lost everything showed his son how to hold a cabinet scraper. If you were really here with me through all of it, I want you to leave me one word in the comments. Just one. The word is standing, because that is what this entire story has been about. Not destruction, and not revenge, and not the satisfaction of watching someone brought low. About the thing that remains when everything else has been tested. About the name on the door. About the door that Eleanor restored. About the wood that tells you what it needs if you are willing to listen. About a father who built something and refused to watch it be taken, and who is still here, still working, still the man whose name is on the sign, standing. Leave it if you were truly here. Subscribe if you have not already. There is a new story on this channel every single day, and some of them are going to reach somewhere in you that you did not know could still be reached. Leave a like if Arthur Whitmore earned it. Share this with someone who is in the middle of a fight like his and needs to know that the fight is winnable. Share it with someone who loves something enough to protect it. Share it with anyone who has ever had to make the choice between the easy thing and the right thing and chose right. From my bench in Bath, England, from the workshop where the light comes through the high windows in the morning, and the smell of linseed oil and old stone is the smell of everything I have ever loved about this work. Thank you. Some things last because they were built correctly and cared for honestly and defended when they needed defending. That is the only secret. That is all there is. Take care of what you built. Take care of each other. Good night.